my name's Amon Martin. I'm the project lead for this shoreline management plan project. And so it's been keeping me busy for kind of 2.5, 3 years. But there's a lot more people involved in this project than just me. It's a TCDC-led project, but there's a few other agencies involved. So I'll introduce a few people. We've got Alejandro, who's just joined us from WRC. Kia ora, Alejandro, Waikato Regional Council.
Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora. We've got Nick, Lewis and Sean from our consultants, Royal Haskoning.
Hello.
Kia ora.
And who else have we got? We've got one of the most important people, Connie. There she is. She's helping to facilitate the meeting. So when she types in, haven't got to this yet, but when you're wanting to ask questions or leave comments, we're going to use the chat function. So at the top, there's a chat button. Type in your feedback, comments throughout the presentation. Connie's going to pause and ask those questions, and even the comments if you feel strongly about something. We want to hear that tonight. So that's the introductions out of the way, and then I'm going to share my screen and hopefully jump straight over to the presentation. But still got cameras on. I don't mind that really, it's fine, but it will be recorded, so when people come to watch you, they will see your expressions, I suppose, which adds to it, I guess. Welcome everyone who keeps kind of coming in. Good to have you here. So slideshow from the beginning. So firstly, the purpose, what we're here to do today is create awareness of the project. So what is the shoreline management plan? Sitting behind that is a lot of work on the hazards. So it's not just an awareness of the project, but it's an awareness of what the hazards are, the work we've done to understand the hazards. So that's a key purpose. The project isn't just about the hazards, it's about working out solutions and pathways. So we're going to present those this evening and we want to get feedback. So that's the second main point of the evening, is to get feedback either through that chat function I just mentioned, or there's a couple of other ways to do that as well. Couple more people joining, which is great, so welcome. Just and hear a couple of things in the background. So that's the purpose, those two things, and how we're going to achieve this purpose is firstly set the scene. So why are we doing this shoreline management plan project? What's it all about? What's it covering, and how we're approaching it? Then we're going to go a bit more specific in terms of the Cook's Beach details. What are the hazards there that we're trying to manage and plan for, and then the feedback. As well as the chat, which definitely encourage you to use. I think I've probably said that 3 times. We've got an email address you can use, and we've got a tool that will show you at the end. The tool's really good. It shows a complete district perspective, so not just the hazards for Cook's Beach, but you might be interested in what's happening in Whiringa, other parts of the coastline. So you can use that tool to get the same information you're going to see tonight, but then even leave comments on other areas. And that's important because things like access, the state highway is not just important for someone who lives next to the state highway, but someone who uses it. So people in Cook's Beach are probably wanting the state highway to remain effective. So firstly, why a shoreline management plan, and what's the scope of this project? So following the 2019 event, there was significant damage on the state highway on the Thames Coast Road. That was in some ways the catalyst for obtaining the funding and progressing this work. There are a few other things like policies and strategies that went beforehand, but that definitely pushed council to make some budget provision, understand how much of a challenge it was. And it wasn't just the state highway. There's other examples around the district. I think you've got Brophy's Beach down the bottom, Wanatiri, and probably a bit closer to home on the bottom right-hand side, Flaxmore Bay, I think, and Thames, which shows some flooding there. So there's lots of examples that happen periodically that either cause flooding or erosion. And so those two things are the focus of the project. The flooding or inundation, we've referred to it as well, and the erosion. So that's coastal flooding and coastal erosion. Other things that we've considered include the rivers, so the impacts on the rivers on the coastline. Stormwater is something we think about in some cases. Stiff cliff instability, so where there's eroding areas that are less or partially to do with the coastline, but as much to do with the nature of the cliff, and often it's a road alongside that cliff. So there's tsunamis, the last thing I mentioned. So all those things are thought about, but not to the same level that the flooding, inundation, and the coastal flooding and the erosion are considered. So how are we doing it? It's good to have some guidance, and there's some guidance nationally that was put out by the Ministry for the Environment on 2017. So that's really good. And a few key things rolling around the circle from 1 through to 7. What is happening? So understanding the flooding risk and potential sea level rise or other impacts. What matters most? So what's actually vulnerable? What's sitting behind the risk? Are there schools and houses, or is it just open land and farmland? So some things are more vulnerable than others, and we need to understand that, understand the risks that different places are facing. Then up to 5 and 6, we're trying to think about what we can do about it. So firstly, we cast the net pretty wide, and we take a view that many things are possible, and then we start to narrow down those options. The options aren't just single options either, because you do have to consider how the risks and challenges change over time. And so some options are suitable now, but 20, 40 years away, the risks and the challenges will change, and the options and the approach need to change. So that's a little bit about adaptive planning. So that's number 7. And we've started, or we have done quite a bit of work on triggers as well. So understanding what needs to happen when. So that's really what that triggers mean. So that's where the project finishes. We end up with a plan that understands the hazards, looks at the solution, and suggests a plan to go forward. And it's not a short-term plan. It's a 100 years plus plan, but you actually also are impacting on things in the near future. So as well as looking right out to 100 years, we've got to make recommendations and plan for the next 10, 20 years as well. So who's doing this project? So it isn't just me. There's a whole team involved, and one of the most important aspects to the team or the structure is these coastal panels. So the coastline's about 400 kilometres long. We've broken it up into 4 areas. So this area we're talking about is Mercury Bay. We've got the Thames Coast, Thames Coast, and Thames-Coromandel in the north and southeast. But this area is Mercury Bay. So the coastal panel is made up of about 10, 12 community representatives. So different ages and backgrounds, not employed by council, but elected, asked to nominate themselves or be nominated and then selected to represent the community. So when we do the coastal hazard assessment, that's where we take the information. We put it in front of those coastal panels. We spend quite a bit of time working through the hazards. So something that the coastal panels are better positioned to think about than us as the kind of technical expert is what matters most to the community. So we put the hazard in front of them, and they talk about what actually does that mean for the community and what's important. So those coastal panels are doing a lot of that work to inform and develop this plan. Supporting them is the technical advisory group, and that's a bit of a partnership approach that includes Waikato Regional Council. So you had Alejandro there. There's people like Rick Leifting as well, technical expertise coming in to support that work. And you've got Waka Kotahi sitting in that technical group. Then above that, you've got decision makers, I suppose. When the plan gets recommended by these coastal panels, and when they that goes to a committee. So the committee that's been established is just for the shoreline management plan work, and it includes 4 councillors and 4 iwi reps. So the 2 most relevant for this year are Tony Fox and Joe Davis. So they sit alongside 3 others to make a total of 8 people on that committee. So that's how the structure's put together. Just you've been on the screen for a while, so you're probably wondering what that big access thing means, surrounded by lots of words. So when we think about the values and objectives, we spent quite a bit of time, a few rounds of public meetings. So that's not just one. I think we do about 5 each time to cover the whole district. A few meetings and surveys to say what are the values, what are the things most important to you living on the Coromandel. And so one that was pretty much the came out the strongest was access. So that generally means being able to get to your home, get to work, not being cut off. Probably influenced a bit by the fact we had that big event that caused significant damage on the Thames Coast Road. So that came through quite strongly after that. But sitting next to that is the natural aspect of the Coromandel, the beaches and the environment. See the appearance down here. You look closely, and there's lots of other things, but that's a real snapshot of what the community, the wider community, told us what was important. So here's a slide that talks a little bit, and I've mentioned it briefly, about the risk assessments. So it's hazards which allow us to understand where the water will go or where the erosion might go, and then we look at vulnerability and exposure. So what's exposed and how vulnerable that is, and that gives us a risk assessment score. We've done that for the whole of the district at a high level, and then we've come down and we've focused in on places that are showing significant risk. Places like Thames, places like Cook's Beach, Whitianga. There's quite a few across the Coromandel Peninsula that are facing or will face significant risk in the future. So that's quite a bit of me talking. This is the first chance where I've got a slide that makes me pause and check to see if there are questions or comments. We haven't got to anything specific about Cook's Beach, but hopefully that gives you a feel for the overall project. A couple of other things to note. I've mentioned it's a 3-year project. We are aiming to have this adopted by council in September. So that will go through the committee, the Shoreline Management Plan Committee, and then adopted by council. That's what we're targeting. We've got another round of coastal panel meetings. So any feedback we receive today will go to those coastal panel meetings. We've also got another in-person round of in-person consultation events planned. And so that's another chance for us to share what we're doing and represent the pathways when they're updated with any feedback from this event and from the next round of the coastal panel. So Connie, any comments or questions so far?
Hi everyone. We had quite a few people join after Eamon had started speaking, so I'll just run through how we're going to take feedback tonight for those of you that didn't hear that at first. If you haven't used Teams before, just have a look along the top of your screen and you'll see a speech bubble with 2 lines in it. If you click on that, that's going to bring up the chat thread, and that's where you can type in your questions or type in your comments. It doesn't have to be a question. If you just have a thought or something you want to leave with the team, you can place it there and we will record all of those comments and make sure they make it into the feedback. But while we do have Eamon here tonight to answer your questions, I'd encourage you to type them in there. And as we move through the presentation, there'll be regular pauses to take your questions if you want clarification on anything that you've seen, or you want to bring up something that you know about as a resident in your area that you think we should be taking account of. I'll be reading those, and when we get to a question point, I'll ask them for you. So we don't have any at the moment, Eamon, so we can carry on, and I'll keep an eye on it.
Great, thanks Connie. And not just me able to answer questions, we've got our consultants, so if there are difficult ones, I'll probably pick on Nick, or maybe even Alejandro. So there is a bit of knowledge kind of sitting at the table to be able to support answering those questions, which is quite valuable. So please make the most of it. So Cook's speech specific details. So 3 things, and probably, well, they're all important, but the first one is the hazard assessment. So just go through a little bit in detail to try and make sure people understand what the assessment we've done is, how the sea level rise is going to impact Cook's Beach. We touched briefly on the erosion as well. Then we come to solutions. The way we've looked at solutions is important, linking those community values, and then we present or show the proposed pathways. And so those pathways are what really give you our plan, what is planned over a period of time. And if those are things you support, we want to hear those. If you think there's changes required, we also want to hear that as well. So firstly, the Cook's Beach, or the hazard assessment generally. So there's actually 3 hazard assessments, or we've broken Cook's Beach into 3 areas. This area, or this picture, I think best represents what's shown. And so firstly, there's a few acronyms and things that you might not be familiar with. The first one on this legend on the right hand side is 1% AEP. So that actually means annual exceedance probability in terms of 1%, and that means an event that isn't likely or is likely to happen once in 100 years. So it's a very, very big event, very kind of uncommon, rare event. You may not see it in your lifetime, that type of event. So that's what we've assessed, or that's what we've shown on the maps today. We haven't just looked at 1% AEPs. There is also information around the 20-year, 5-year, and the king tide. So we've got an understanding of a whole lot of different scenarios, and we've used those different scenarios to inform the coastal panels when we're talking about risk as well. So that's the type of event, or the big event that you're seeing today. Going down, you've got SLR, which is sea level rise. And so the first colour is light blue. And so anything you can see on the map that is blue or light blue, so up the river here on the beach itself, that would get wet during our 1% AEP now. So that's good news in a way, because most of Cook's Beach, there's probably a little bit down by the playground that's an exception, but most of Cook's Beach isn't susceptible to a big event right now. So that's okay. And even these areas not coloured, some of those are not even susceptible to flooding. And I mean, it's not surprising that's a hill there, but it's not going to be flooded even with 100 years of climate change or 1.4 meters of sea level rise. When you then go down to, I think probably the green is the first one we can see, so not much change in this pinkish color, maybe some right along the beachfront, but then you go to the green and you start to see areas that are vulnerable in a 100-year event. So that's a big event. So there's quite a few starting to pop up here. Just mention the assessments that we're showing here are purely based on coastal inundation. So I am aware of the river running through and the flooding challenges that provides as well. You've got the campground somewhere in here and community hall, tennis club there as well. So that green area would be subject to flooding in a 0.4 sea level rise scenario. But then going a couple of steps further out to 0.8 and probably 1 meters and 1.2 meters sea level rise, almost all of Cook's Beach would be susceptible to that really big event. And you've got a bit of a high ridge in the middle that wouldn't be affected until it got to 1.4. So depends if how you look at it, is glass half full or glass half empty, but the good news is there's not significant risk right now, but looking out long term, which this project does, it's anticipated that most of Cook's Beach will have a risk related to a really big event. So one of the key things is that sea level rise. And there's a lot of work being done on sea level rise and climate change. And so what we do know is in the short term, some things are more certain. So if you look out 20 years, you can almost lock in the 20 centimetres or 0.2 metres. And as you go up or out in time, you start to get to that 0.4 area in 2060 and 2100. Then there becomes quite a divergence. So it could still be at 0.4 or 0.45, but has the potential to be right up at 1 metre. So that's where the uncertainty is. And one thing that's sometimes said or often said, and it is correct, we do plan for the worst, or we consider the worst and hope for the best. So if we stayed on this green line and only got 0.6, 0.4 sea level rise, then a lot of Cook's Beach wouldn't be inundated in a big event, and the risk would stay relatively low. So that's an interesting thing just to keep in the back of your mind when we come to the pathways. Inundation isn't the only hazard. So we have done work on coastal erosion. And so what's shown here is a few things: coastal erosion right now, or expected erosion lines out to 2040 and 2070 and 2120. And so quite a lot of erosion shown. Those erosion lines are based on not having protection. If I've said that incorrectly, please someone from the technical team correct me. But 95% sure that this work here is, or this erosion prediction is based on no erosion protection. So there is some erosion protection, and that will have an impact on whether or not this erosion eventuates. So some of those lines match up quite closely with what's in our district plan already. So you can see the black solid line and the black dotted line, and so that's work that's already been done to predict erosion lines, and that's embedded in our district plan. So they're not a million miles away from what's already there. More conservative on this side, largely because it hasn't fully taken into account the protection that's there, I think. and a little bit less conservative on the western side. Relatively speaking, the erosion challenge in the long term is a lot less of an issue, would affect a lot less houses than the inundation issue in the very long term. So then we come back to solutions, or we start looking at solutions, and we do have cast the net wide in terms of the district. So avoiding development is one thing we consider. In Cook's Beach, possibly not as relevant. There's a lot of development already there. But if there was an area to be developed that had a high hazard assessment, now we would probably look to encourage people not to develop there. The other thing you can do is you can retreat in some cases within your property, or you can build your floor levels up to make sure you're up above the flood inundation levels. And the last thing there is protecting. So building stop banks or flood walls, that's an option we've considered from a district perspective. So you can see some nice pictures which kind of capture the natural environment through to a defended coastline. And we're needing to reflect back on the values and what the communities told us earlier on in the process. And some of those things are that the nature is important, the beaches are important. So they kind of steer us towards a softer approach in many instances. So just another example of how you might think about protection or erosion protection or even flood protection, going from managing the sand dunes through planting. You could intervene, you could push back the sand dunes and plant them, so that starts to become soft engineering. You've got, I think, a backstop wall in Cook's Beach, so you've got a buried structure, and that's kind of starting to get hard, but it's overlaid by sand and planting, so it's really in the balance of hard and soft, that kind of option. And then you get to concrete walls and sheet piling, which is really hard. So those are the hazard assessments and an example of what the solutions we've thought about are. The next thing is the pathways, but over to you, Connie, to see if we've got some questions.
We don't have any questions at the moment, Amon. So for those people that have joined while Amon's been speaking, we're just using the chat function to take your questions. It's along the top bar of your screen. You'll see a speech bubble with 2 lines in it. Just click on that and you can type your questions in there. And I would encourage you to ask your questions if you have any, while we have the team here to answer them for you.
Thanks again, Connie. I don't think I've missed anything there. I'll just go back to this just to remind us what some of those timeframes look like and the uncertainty around the different flooding events. So you can see the 2120, there's a range of 0.5 to 1.4, I think, in terms of when that might happen. So then we'll jump to the solution or the pathway. So there's these 3 posters here, and so on the left-hand side, very much just what I've talked through. That's the inundation risk. The top is just a location, and a blue line here is showing where this pathway applies, where this policy unit, we call it, or area, the extent of the area we're looking at. And then down here is the actual plan. So what are we going to do? So here, avoid developing in the hazard affected areas unless, I guess, raised floor levels of the ground is raised. So that's quite a common, sensible thing to say for a lot of policy areas where there is a current or future hazard. But then it also says plan for retreat from a hazard affected areas, and planning, understanding how places might need to transition, talking to communities about when and how. That's what this means. And even tonight, or this project, is part of making people aware of the hazards so they can make an informed decision as well. But we don't actually think any sort of retreatment is required until 0.6 or 0.8 metres of sea level rise. That's when the 1% or the big flood events start to have a significant effect here. And just so it's on the right page, we've gone back to the graph and said, oh, what does 0.6 sea level rise mean in terms of years? And we've shown a number of 57 years. So that's the 57 years, which is used the conservative, or not quite the worst case, but the conservative upper line, and 71 years for the 0.8. So more than likely, we might have a couple of 20-year-olds who will live for 70 years and be able to see this eventuate, but for most of us, beyond the lifetime of us. So that's the first area. I'll go through all three, and then if there's a question, so if there's a question on this particular pathway or this map, just use either first, second, or third, and we can jump back to it to look at more detail or explain things as required.
We do have a few questions at the moment, Eamon. I don't know if you want to just quickly address those before we go on to the next ones.
Yes, yep.
So the first one is, the backstop wall at Cook's keeps getting eroded. Is it likely to become a hardened bulkhead in the future?
Yeah, in the future, yes, that's my opinion. But that word "future" is very open-ended. Will it stay covered in sand for 10, 20 years or longer? I'm not sure. That as sea level rise starts to happen, the effect of erosion becomes worse. So if you didn't get any sea level rise, you might hope or anticipate that planting could establish and the backstop wall remains covered. But when sea level rise starts to have an impact, and if it's 20 or 40 years away, that's definitely going to make erosion worse, and therefore probably will expose that backstop wall in the future, but not in the near future, hopefully.
That's great. Thank you, Eamon. The next question is, can we access this information down to specific property addresses?
Only to the extent of the maps shown. So I'll come to it at the end. What we've got is a whole lot of maps that show property addresses and inundation levels. I'll also highlight where you can find the other information, so where the 20-year events and the king tide events are. And so you could drill down and see where your property is, understand when it's going to be affected, but we don't have a register of hazards against properties. So that the answer is yes, but only by using the maps and looking at the maps to see where your property is.
Perfect, thanks. And then just a clarification question on which is the backstop wall. Is the backstop wall the rock wall in front of the home's beachside on Captain Cook Drive?
No. Go back. Sorry for. So you in front of the homes. So in front of the homes, there's a rock wall, and there used to be and there is still a Cook's Memorial. So the Cook's Memorial has been moved due to erosion, and the location where the Cook's Memorial used to be is where there is a backstop wall. You can't always tell that it's there because it's often buried and hopefully plants get established over it. I've been there for 3 or 4 months or even 6, and I couldn't see it last time I was there. But I will use that. If you can see my arrow, probably not very well, is where the backstop wall is, that bit there. Whereas the homeowner's wall is more where the green line shown.
That's great, thank you. So the last question for this section is, will individual property owners be permitted to fill or build seawalls or other forms of protection?
So that's a very good question. So what we are showing, and it's the same on the next two, is we're not advocating for protection. We are saying putting flood protection around Cook's Beach, even in the long term, is not the right thing to do. And so the project team and the coastal panels have come up with that as a suggestion, a proposal, what we think is the right pathway, leaning back strongly on what the values are in terms of wanting to keep the beach as natural as possible and having beach access. So if there's a different opinion about protecting Cook's Beach, that's what we're here to hear. But that's what we're saying at the moment, that we would not advocate for protecting Cook's Beach from inundation in the long term.
Great, thank you. We don't have any more questions at the moment.
Okay, I'll probably add one more thing to that protection aspect. It is, even though we'd advocate strongly, we probably, I think it's the right way to put it, it would become much more difficult to put protection in if the pathway was adopted. So this long-term plan is really direction setting, and it's likely to be picked up and put into other planning instruments, so that if you did try and put a rock wall in a place where people are saying it's not the best thing to do, then it would not be impossible, but it would become quite difficult to do it. There's a couple of other kind of things to say on that, but I'll go through these pathways. So the next one, as you can see at the top, really includes the whole of the beachfront. So that's that, not that good with colours, but blue, it's not magenta, but aqua probably. And so again, we want to maintain the native species and manage the access and the dunes as much as possible. So we do often have, whether it's children or just the volume of public that are axing across the sand dunes, or it can be vehicles or even boats. And so we want to make sure that they aren't damaging the sand dunes. Those sand dunes do play a very important part to preventing erosion, and so we want to do that where we can. Then as we get to point 2, and so I mentioned briefly that those are our triggers, we would look to do more or promote the use of more soft engineering. So reinstate the dune, you could be pushing sand up and then replanting it to make sure that we are providing erosion protection, but as much as possible in a soft engineering way, rather than the rocks that are there, more the case of backstop walls or other softer engineering approaches. Working your way down, then there's becomes a need to retrofit or raise some hazard affected properties. So once you get to point 2, which is some 20 years away, some of those houses will be susceptible to inundation. I guess another viewpoint we could hear today is, well, that's only going to happen once every 100 years. At that point, we'd probably just clean up our houses, sweep out the sand, and you may not get your houses significantly damaged. but as you work through further sea level rise scenarios, some of those lower houses would actually start to see that significant damage. So what we're suggesting is you start to do that earlier rather than get the damage. You get a little bit proactive. And so maintaining existing defences, that's in there. We believe that's an appropriate thing to do if they're already there. And then changing planning practices and preparing for relocation of assets. So some of that could happen at 0.2 and 0.4 metres of sea level rise in preparation for the 0.6 and the 0.8 where the hazard becomes significant. But one of the things that is generally understood is the more time you give to transition, the easier or the less of a burden it is on individuals. So that definitely is something that's been considered. So we could wait and do nothing all the way to 0.8, and all of a sudden there's a big event and we can't rebuild and things happen all of a sudden. But we're wanting to do things proactively, is what's been said here. Any questions coming through on this post, Connie?
Yeah, we do have a few questions. So not all of them regarding this poster specifically, but we might move through them so that we can have space for more as we go along. The first one's really just a comment from someone saying that they have a batch in a hazard affected area and they've spent 20,000 to get approval from the council to raise it. And they've found council really unhelpful in giving them information regarding the levels to go to, saying that the responsibility to find and prove the levels was put on them. And they had to register their batch in a high-risk area as part of that approval. So they're finding nothing but barriers to the mitigation that they are seeking to do as private property owners.
Yeah, that's good feedback. We had that. Was it Warikaho Simpsons? No, at one of the other meetings. I think we've done about 11, so I can't quite remember. But one of the suggestions was, if raising floor levels and adapting is a suggested approach from the pathway, council should support that by reducing the consenting costs, so not actually charging for the consenting costs. And that seemed like a good idea. But yeah, making it easier for people to proactively manage their own hazards, raising their floor levels and getting the information is definitely really good feedback. A bit of a kind of a period of where we're just developed this hazard information. We're feeding it through to our building consent team, but it's pretty new and the processes aren't streamlined at this point. So something that we want to do is take the hazard information in partnership with regional council and apply it or put it onto a portal that makes it much more accessible. Regional council's already developed a really good portal with information on it, but it doesn't have this coastal inundation information at this stage. So doing that is something we think would be helpful for someone who's looking for it.
Thank you. Well, the next question comes in two parts. The first part is, do you envisage new builds will ever be precluded on existing residential sites? If so, when would this surface in a district plan?
Yes is the answer to that question, and the other thing that's in that question is ever. So at some point when you have 1.4 metres of sea level rise and this was a very high hazard area, yes, I think new builds you'd start to be precluding or saying new builds couldn't happen unless they had a way of managing the hazards. It would seem difficult at first glance to work out how you manage the hazard of very high poles possibly, but so to answer that question yes. The really difficult thing is when, and I'm well, not sure in terms of time frames, and it would depend on exactly where the property was in Cook's Beach. But if I was to give my best guess, it might be around 0.6 or 0.4 sea level rise. Probably just caveat that answer in that I don't really know when that would happen, but you would need to see some level of sea level rise happen before that precluding new builds would happen.
The second part to that question, Eamon, is are sand groins seen as another option for building up the beach, and how successful have groins been in the area? Are the groins been in the area?
Yes, it's something we've looked at. I am not the best person to answer that. I'm wondering if this is one of those difficult questions Nick might want to comment on in terms of sand groins, if he's there.
Yeah, I'm absolutely here, Eamon. Yeah, hello everyone. So by sand groins, I'm assuming that is directed towards effectively putting sand on the beach, beach renourishment, whatever the term is, effectively adding sand from other places onto the beachfront to increase the subaerial volume of the beach. So that was definitely looked at. It could be a measure that is implemented. However, that particular method is pretty unpredictable, and given the actual timeframes of the hazards on this particular beach, it wasn't seen as something that the project team or council were favourable of, and it's very similar to other harder measures. Effectively, it's engineering intervention, and which wasn't seen as a effective priority here. So
yeah, just probably add to that, it's quite where they do work is quite location specific. So they might work around the corner, but depending on how the sediment's moving across the beach and a whole lot of other things, it may or may not work. There's a real science behind trying to implement those.
Thanks, Eamon. The next question is, could a vehicle beach access way be reconstructed to enable continued access, albeit over a rising ramp?
A vehicle beach, can you read it again? I'm just trying to get my head around that question.
Sure. Could a vehicle beach access way be reconstructed to enable continued access, albeit over a rising ramp?
I'm guessing what that means. There could be a vehicle access somewhere in here, where I think you could get a quad bike down or something. And if you were to put a flood protection bund in front of it, you would need the vehicle access to go up and over a flood protection bund. So the answer to that, as I understand it, is yes, it could be. And you can build, definitely re-contour vehicle ramps to go up and over things. The practicality of it would depend very much on the site and how high do you need to go up, how far does it go down, what's the erosion like. But in theory, yes, you could do that.
Great,
Hang
thank
on.
you.
Sorry, could I just add something to that? I think the comment might be in reference to where we say soft engineering, we say reinstate dune where it's been modified at vehicle beach access way. And you're right that just about where you were pointing, just west of centre of the beach, there is a vulnerable point where inundation is likely to start occurring earlier, and it's where the dune's been levelled for beach access way. And so the suggestion is that the sand dunes are built back up in that area, potentially even with a backstop wall. And I think the thinking was that you could create a new access way over the top of it if it included engineering elements. So sorry, but I just know about that specific issue.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sean. That's a lot more specific detail than I had on hand. And so if that's a viable thing or a suggested thing, please include that because it may, in the short term, help alleviate, or in the medium term, it could be a weak point for flooding that could buy us time or reduce impacts to some houses. Yeah, so that's good feedback.
Thanks, Amon. We do have a few more questions, so I'll move quickly on to the next one. There are many examples of successful major protection works around the world. So why has this been rejected even before consultation has occurred?
Yes, I agree. They have been successful. Lasted on the Waiho. I used to manage the Hauraki flood protection schemes, the Waiho and the Piako, some of the biggest ones in the country. Yes, and they've been able to do their job for quite a long period of time. We're still getting feedback on these proposed pathways. So if there is a strong call for protection of the Cook's Beach, yes, we will consider that, and we will put that in front of the panels, and we will reconsider how many houses could potentially be protected, the timeframes of that, and so that will be something we think about. So if that's what you're advocating, please do that in the notes because we're still developing, getting feedback on this proposal. It hasn't been adopted. It still has to go to the coastal panel, through the committee, and then through council. So there is a chance for feedback. The reason we haven't got it yet is largely due to the desire to keep the natural environment. So there is an understanding or a perception, feeling that putting stop banks around Cook's Beach isn't what people would want. Even thinking about that in the long term, there's also a practicality issue of needing to effectively purchase a whole strip of houses to build something that would protect the remainder of Cook's Beach. And so there's also a practicality aspect to it. So those are a couple of reasons why we're not advocating protection at this stage.
Thanks, Amon. We've got two questions around managed retreat, so I'll just read both of them out. The first one is, what does relocation practically mean? What does it mean in practice? And the second one is, what support does the council propose to support those who are in the managed retreat zone?
There is a lot of work going on right now, and I've got bits of paper in front of me. I don't know if you can see that, but that's called the National Adaptation Plan, and there's the draft managed retreat system proposal. So that came out 1.5 weeks ago, and consultation on that is closing the 3rd of June. So if you were wanting to look that up, you would just type in National Adaptation Plan New Zealand, and that would take you to the website. The reason I mentioned that is the guidance, the rules, how managed retreat will actually happen is evolving. It's being worked on. There isn't this is how managed retreat will happen. Do we have to, or should we purchase properties? Is that's what recommended when you get to a certain point? What I did find interesting, and someone with connections to Cook's Beach, is a few presentations from Belinda Story, and she's talked about, and I think it's probably a concept that has happened in other places, is leases. So leases are not uncommon. They happen all over the place. So potentially people could be given a lease for 50 or 100 years on the understanding that they wouldn't need to move, but after the 50 or 100 years, that property wouldn't be viable anymore. So those type of things are being discussed. We don't exactly know how a managed retreat would be initiated or happen at this stage. There's probably a couple of other perspectives, I think. One is what is managed retreat for a community? And so a community might decide to open up land and develop in areas that are not prone to hazards. So as a community over time, you'd have more houses on higher ground or even in hills away from coastal hazards. So you can retreat as a community, but then there's also the individual perspectives. So don't have all the answers on what that would exactly look like, but I hope that gives you some indication. I've probably got a couple more things I could say if people are more interested in what that might be. But yeah, any other questions?
Thanks, Amon. We do have a question. Who will measure sea level rise and how will that be done?
At the moment, there's a network of gauges that people, so sea level gauges across the country and the world, but more relevant to us is the country. And so those gauges are being used to measure sea level rise, look at trends, and I think there's been additional gauges proposed and put in place recently to help with that those measurements. So in terms of who runs them, I think NIWA basically manage the gauges and collect the information, and then they periodically write reports to say how climate change is impacting New Zealand or sea level rise is impacting New Zealand. So it's a global perspective on sea level rise, but we want to understand the New Zealand perspective as well. Another factor to that can be land movement. And so recently, as kind of a week ago, there was a lot of information that came out about land movement. From memory, relatively stable here in Cook's Beach, but some places like Wellington are actually sinking just as much as sea level rise is going up. So that adds to the challenge, and you do need to think about the local impact rather than just the global. But luckily here, relatively stable from the information I've seen.
Thanks, Amon. Another question. Could you give us a rough picture of what a complete Cook's Beach inundation protection system might look like? Would it need floodgates on the rivers, for example, as well as barriers on the lower beachfront areas?
Right. I can try.
I can also help with this, Eamon, if you would like.
Yep, sure. I'll pass this over to you, Nick. Is there a picture that's most relevant, or maybe this one is better to talk to?
This is probably good, Eamon. So as the person asking the question, so I can't see the name, but they've got the picture anyway. It would be multifaceted. It'd be multiple pieces of infrastructure because the hazards come from different mechanisms. There's obviously the inundation from the ocean front, and then the sort of inundation from the two tidal inlets, stroke rivers. So it would need to be a combination of such things like stop banks. They would need to practically encircle the township effectively, where they coincide with existing roads, for example. That they would need to be thought about, whether the roads go over those such stop banks or where you have gates, for example. So there's a few pieces of infrastructure there. One unobvious, or what's probably unobvious, is the management of stormwater as well. So as the sea level rises in its ambient conditions, and then also in storm events, the management of stormwater becomes more of a problem as well. So the opportunity for free drainage is reduces or diminishes, and therefore stormwater systems such as pumping systems would also need to be, or most likely need to be, included. There's also a bit of a hidden hazard in terms of rising groundwater as well. Now, we certainly haven't looked into that in enough detail here, but rising groundwater is certainly an issue in other places such as Thames, for example. And then lastly, as the person asking the question has pointed out, there would need to be protection across the ocean front as well. So it's effectively a multiple approach, multiple infrastructure, which would encircle the township, and then would also include possible needs to manage groundwater and stormwater. Now, that as you go on into the future with an ever increasing sea level, that infrastructure becomes more and more prominent, more and more sophisticated from its engineering perspective, and therefore the considerations become greater. Obviously, in a more immediate time, that could be a relatively lighter touch, but certainly as things go on, it becomes more significant.
Thanks very much, Nick. And just visually, I suppose you've got the stream coming out, so it's not just the seafront. You have to work your way all the way up through to tennis courts at least, and probably a bit further up along that river. So yeah, quite a lot to do to protect, if we were to protect Cook's Beach. I think we're still here, but any more questions there, Connie?
We just do have a few more comments, but no questions. So you may want to work through the feedback or the rest of what is in your slides at this point.
Great. So the last one that we've got is really the harbour. So Hurangi River, and so a lot less of an issue there. You can see we've just got maintain existing levels of service only, except where accommodation space is to be provided. Provide space for nature in hazard affected areas. Where there's no existing development. Maintain, rehabilitate native species and manage access. So what this is kind of saying is we would advocate, and it would, I remember talking about this with the coastal panels, if there was farmland that was on the fringes of the estuary, we would suggest allowing space for nature, and planting programs in partnership with landowners would be better than trying to protect those margins. And so there isn't a huge amount affected, but that's the principle that would be suggesting. Probably the landowner would have a lot more influence in that kind of decision. That it would be one property rather than a number of communities, and whether or not you could agree, or you'd understand I don't know for sure exactly what species or what environmental importance some of those areas have. The landowners probably know best and would know what areas they would like to see allowing space for nature. So that's that one. So less of a hazard up the Purangi River, and an opportunity to enhance the natural environment is what we're saying there. I will go to the next slide. I think don't need to pause there because we've had lots just recently already. I'm gonna run through the feedback, hand over, I'll show the website, and then at the end another chance for questions before we wrap up. So comments, great that you found the chat function and added those questions and comments. The other way to do that is through our coast at tcdc.govt.nz. Like I mentioned, all the feedback, if you're advocating for protection or not protection, that will be taken through to the coastal panels for further consideration. And we do have a website, so hopefully I will just go to that now and can show you what it looks like. So anyone external to TCDC can go straight to the TCDC website, and it's just tcdc.govt.nz. If you put a / and SMP, that brings up the shoreline management plan page. What we try and do is keep the most relevant topical things at the top of the page, and so these meetings are the most relevant right now. This is actually the last one of 1, 2, 3. I'm not sure, it might be 11 meetings there. And so here is the link to the feedback tool, and I'll hand over to Sian to just talk through how to use that very quickly. But you can also get poster information down the side by pushing the download button, and going further down, there is more information on the project, on the different hazard scenarios, and so a lot more information there. And I've taken you to this point because this helps us if you're interested in the 5% AEP and the king tide. We've only really talked about the 100-year event, but there are scenarios that show you what the smaller events look like. And basically, the smaller events become the bigger events over time. It's a very simple way of looking at it. So back up to, we'll hand over to Sian now, who will show you how to use that tool. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Eamon. Right, so hopefully you'll be seeing my screen now. Eamon showed you the button at the bottom of my screen. By click on this link, you can get to the feedback tool. If you do that, it takes you to this screen here. And first of all, it provides you with an introduction and a description of what the project's doing, the information you can find there, and the types of responses we'd like from you, the types of things we'd like you to tell us. So do you support, do you disagree with the adaptation pathways that have been included, and so on. It also gives you some instructions on how to leave a comment, but the key to it all is if you click on the map button at the top here, it then repeats those instructions on how to leave a comment, just so that no one's in any doubt. And it takes you to a map of the Coromandel. You can then see, once it populates itself, the different stretches of the coast that we have, or how we've divided the coast up. You can see people have been leaving comments. Then you can zoom in just by clicking these plus and minus buttons to the part of the coast you're interested in. You click on a piece of coast, and so I have clicked here on Flaxmill, and that brings you to the poster for that stretch of coastline. Click on it again, and it allows you to look at the adaptation pathway for that stretch of coast in a nice big format in your own time on your own screen. Then in terms of adding a comment, there's a little button here. It says add comment. As I say, this is all covered in the instructions. Add a feature. Gives you this little arrow. You can put that arrow, and you can zoom in further than I have, but you can put that arrow wherever you want to leave a comment. Click on the screen, and then you can leave your name. You don't have to, but then you type in that comment, and then when you press create, it saves it, and then that information is stored. And that's it. Eamon.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to skim through to see if there's any more questions. I think Stephen might have a question. If you put it in the chat, we'll do our best to answer it, and or read it out directly through Connie. So I see Jamie Boyle. I didn't introduce him at the start. He's our coastal scientist. He didn't get directed the difficult questions, but he's done a great job of answering a few just in the chat there. So thanks very much for that, Jamie. And unless there's any final questions, we will end the meeting. Thank you everyone for coming. It's been a pretty good turnout. We did approach this largely with letter drops because we didn't know if our radio and a paper advertising was working. We do have the in-person meetings coming up. So Cook Speech will be discussed or covered at the Whitianga meeting, which is just is in June, and it is the 18th of June. And so that's Whitianga, the 18th of June, where we'll possibly change some of these pathways. They may stay pretty much the same, but your feedback will influence that. So hope to see some of you there in person, or any more feedback, email or use the tool. Thanks very much for your time tonight. Appreciate the support of Connie and the others in the team. Have a good evening. Just finish by saying, to recognise this can be confronting in some instances, but for Cook Speech, even though there is significant hazard, it is not tomorrow. It is down the track. That might not console people sometimes, but that's what the picture is, and we want to make sure people are aware of that. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.